Okay, everyone. Well, good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University and the Director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, I have two thank yous in order. First, Civil War Trails is one of the co-sponsors of this program. Drew Gruber and that organization have continued to just support us in manifold ways. For those of you who haven't seen a Civil War Trails marker or haven't been to one of the Civil War Trails sites, I'd encourage you to do so. It is one of the largest sort of outdoor living history museums in a sense in the country, and they do fantastic work. And today also marks more broadly the Day of Giving for Shepherd University. And if we do have some donors in the audience tonight, thank you. The day's been actually very successful for us, and so we deeply appreciate all the help that you all have lent to us. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'm going to do so in alphabetical order and in an abridged fashion, because we have three people who've done so much over the course of their careers that I'm going to have to very much condense the introductions. And so at least in my lower left-hand side, we'll begin with Dennis E. Frye. And Dennis is a face that should be familiar to many of you who've tuned into our programs in the past. He is a giant in the field, one of the founding members really of the modern historic preservation movement. He is one of the co-founders of the Safe Historic Antietam Foundation. Dennis spent over 32 years in the National Park Service, a career which culminated as he retired as chief historian of Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. He is a Shepherd alumnus, of which we always like to make note. And he is the author of many, many books and many, many articles. But the two I want to highlight that I think are perhaps most relevant to tonight's presentation, most recently, which he co-authored, is Confluence, Harper's Ferry as Destiny, and also quite recently he published Antietam Shadows, Mystery, Myth, and Machination. I believe I got that right. And so welcome, Dennis. It's always good to see you, and I'm excited that we're going to actually be in the field together this fall. So I haven't actually seen Dennis in person for a very long time, and so that's been something that I missed. Below me on our screen is Jean Libby, and Jean, I should add, is very much the impetus behind this program. She reached out to us and we started a very interesting conversation, and so I must acknowledge her in helping to sort of formulate this idea. Jean maintains the website Allies for Freedom, and she has researched and published on John Brown and the 19th century African-American experience for over 4 decades. She is a retired instructor of US history and ethnic studies at community colleges in Northern California. And she, like our other panelists, has a host of publications, but the ones that I wanted to isolate and highlight in particular are John Brown Mysteries and John Brown Photo Chronology. So we're extremely excited to have Jean with us this evening. And finally, in my upper left-hand side, last but not least, is Jim Surkamp. I've known Jim past couple of years since I've been in Shepherdstown. It's always been wonderful to attend some of the presentations and programs that he does. Jim is indeed a very well-known figure in the Eastern Panhandle and beyond. He does a whole host of very popular tours of historic sites and delivers dramatic presentations, at least 2 of which I've seen and are incredibly good. He actively publishes original research, oral histories, and historic resources, maintains several different websites, which we'll probably talk about today. And he's just compiled an impressive amount of material about Jefferson County during the Civil War era, but also more broadly about African-American history in this region. And so we're going to reference some of those materials tonight as we go through the program. And with that, I would very much encourage any of our audience members to chime in with questions as they have them. Our good friend Rick Wolf, I see, has tuned in. So hi, Rick. We're going to hopefully see you in October. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. And what we'll do tonight is have a bit of more formal presentation and then a bit of discussion. So we're going to sort of pivot between those two approaches. And so with that, I'm going to do a screen share here in a second, and I'm going to turn it over to Jean. And so let me go ahead and get up my resources. And throughout the program, I'm going to be going back and forth between two computers. So I hope I don't make you dizzy, but I want to see the comments and also make sure that I'm doing my duties as a moderator. So multitasking, I should be better at, but I'm not. So. Okay, so let me get this up from start of the show. Okay, and I think we're all set, Jean.
The story of John Brown's attack on Harpers Ferry in October 1859 both begins and ends with death. It has become legend that Brown gave up his own life and sacrificed his sons in order to end slavery. His commitment caught the attention of the world. He gave hope and purpose to those who would continue working and struggling for Black freedom in the United States. But the death that began Brown's raid was of a Black man who was shot in the back, running from John Brown's men guarding the railroad bridge. Hayward Shepherd, baggage master at the Baltimore and Ohio Depot, was illuminated by a lantern that he carried and by the light of the train that had backed up following his alarm. His agonizing death cries were heard throughout the night. Slide. Slide, please. The tall, strong man with African features was probably enslaved at his birth in Frederick County, Virginia, almost 35 years earlier. By whom, or the time of his manumission, is not clear. Haywood married Sarah Elizabeth Briscoe from a free African-American family and settled into a growing middle-class free Black community in Winchester. The young man was good at organizing luggage and freight as well as lifting it. He was given a desk in the depot and space to sleep at the hotel across the street while awaiting the daily from Wheeling to Baltimore at 1:25 a.m. He was issued a pistol to protect the premises from white rowdies. Slide, please. The first firing by Brown's men occurred soon after 1 a.m. when Patrick Higgins, the B&O watchman, was investigating that the man he was replacing was not on duty. Ordered to halt, he ran. The shot made a hole in his hat, but Higgins kept running until he reached the hotel, where he woke Hayward and told him to warn the train. The train did indeed stop, even backed up. The conductor, engineer, and fireman moved cautiously up on the tracks on foot. They heard shots fired, and soon Hayward came down the track with a bullet in his back that went straight through his heart. "Captain, I am shot." Conductor A.J. Phelps helped him into the station and laid Hayward on a plank placed between two chairs. Patrick Higgins, who was among Brown's prisoners, heard the dying man ask for water. Higgins received permission from Brown to bring it to him. Slide. The railroad station agent, Fontaine Beckham, was the guarantor of Hayward's safe passage in the area as a free Black man. He was the mayor of Harpers Ferry. Fontaine Beckham was also killed by Brown's men on October 17, 1859. He was climbing the water tower in an effort to check on the condition of Hayward. The two B&O Railroad men, linked in life, are now forever linked in death. Slide. The story that Haywood was taken prisoner and refused to take up arms with Brown's liberation plan began circulating in the countryside. It was believed by David Henderson, the neighbor of Lewis, Washington. Henderson joined the local forces on Monday afternoon, and the Harper's weekly correspondent David Strother, Fort Crayon, arrived 2 days later and asked his cousin, David Henderson, to write down the events. There was no testimony or interview from people who were nearby at the time of the shooting of Hayward Shepherd or who talked with him, who said that he was asked to join and refused. Slide. The trial of John Brown in Virginia was unusual because of access granted to journalists. In those days, court testimony was not transcribed, only the motions. So the words of John Brown in the newspapers turned around his failure at Harpers Ferry by generating public opinion in the North that slavery should be abolished. In the South, readers were terrified that a general bloody insurrection would occur that had some chance of success if there was significant white support from the North. Why should we shoot a Negro? John Brown said in defense at his trial for murder of Hayward Shepherd. That was not our object. Slide, please. Osborne Anderson and Albert Hazlitt, who was a young white man who had been with John Brown in Bloody, Kansas, were able to hide in a basement on Monday afternoon. They made their way back to Maryland in a rowboat. The 5 men of Brown's forces in Maryland charged with loading weapons left that night before Anderson and Hazlitt arrived. They had not participated in the fighting at Harpers Ferry. So Anderson and Hazlitt separated in Pennsylvania. Hazlitt was captured and brought back to jail in Virginia, where Brown and the surviving men pretended not to know him. But he was hanged in January 1860. Osborne Anderson was assisted along the Underground Railroad, hiding for several weeks at a store in York, Pennsylvania, owned by William Goodrich, an African-American businessman who was a Daguerrean photographer. Slide. The Find a Grave Memorial at Woodlawn Cemetery, pictured here, is cataloged by the name on the headstone, Hayward Shepherd. It was registered in April 2018. An earlier Find a Grave Memorial is for Hayward, spelled with an E, or Hayward, spelled with an A, Shepherd, at the Winchester Fairfax Colored Cemetery, where he was buried with Virginia military honors 4 days later. His grave there cannot be located. The entire cemetery has disappeared. It was registered at Find a Grave in January 2014. So Sarah Shepherd and the 5 children moved to Washington soon after her husband was killed. It's not known when his remains were reburied at Woodlawn. This is the book by Eugene Meyer, in which he describes the experience of finding Haywood's grave. Thank you for being here this evening, Gene. And thank you very much, Dr. Jim Broomall and Tim Ware at the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War, for the opportunity to develop Searching for Hayward Shepherd. That's the end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay. So I don't know why I'm doubling sound here. Apologize. Oh, I think we're okay now. Okay. So thank you very much, Gene, and thank you for the audiences that continue to join us and say hello. Mike Chansey, Sharon Murray in particular, both good friends of ours. And again, Gene, thank you very much. So what I'll do at this point is, I'm going to open it up a bit, and I would like to situate Shepherd within the broader context of antebellum and the very beginning Civil War era of Jefferson County. This is a region that is very much in a liminal space. Harpers Ferry features an industrialized landscape. Jefferson County itself has a pretty significant enslaved population, but we're also right on the border of Maryland and then eventually the Free State of Pennsylvania. And so there's a lot of different forces that I think are very much shaping the historical context for Brown's raid, but also for the experiences of both enslaved and free African Americans. And so maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Dennis and Jim as you can expand upon those points. And then as necessary, I can queue up some more images that we've had. So with that, I think I'll initially turn it over to Jim.
Okay.
Great.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. It's a big mistake to project any other idea of the state of slavery on Jefferson County because it's unlike any other. Jim Taylor, the historian of the Black community, said to me, if you were to have like a layered cake and cut it in half and look at it from the side, that's Jefferson County. Every type of situation, good and bad, and the life of a Black person is here. As we came up to toward the Civil War, the general rule was you did not want to be sold south. You could escape easily if you chose, but of course, then what do you do for work? The presence of Storer College after the war gave a good reason to stay here and get educated, but being sold south was the worst thing. If you want to do some research, I'll just give you one name, Benjamin Drew. And you're going to find that he's at Dock South, and he has tons of interviews with escapees from the South. But you didn't want to be sold south for the fact that they were much more cruel. George Johnson escaped from Harpers Ferry, and he said the whipping was just unbelievable. And the other thing is, you would have people who might have inherited a lot of land. It was the case with the Dandridge family. Young people who were not good with money, but they're really good at spending it. And they all, the family of one generation inherited like 5 farms. They couldn't farm. A total of 170 people were sold in about 5 auctions over 20 years. You did not want to be sold south. So that it was more like bungling and that kind of thing, that there were instances of true true evil, a man whose hand was chopped off for lying that lived in the poor farm and other things like that. But what we must always remember is it took me 30 years to get to know and dearly appreciate Jim Taylor, his father, Doug Taylor, who saw a cross burned on the courthouse steps in 1921. And George Rutherford, Bertha Fox Jones. I hung around long enough and did work that they valued on Martin Delaney that they opened up. People who are researching books or deriving more stuff from other research books will never get their trust. Somehow I hung around long enough and they told me things I'll say this. When John Brown's raid occurred, Jim Taylor said to me after 30 years, we didn't respond because we thought he was another black man like Nat Turner. You laid low. The word, he said, circulated quickly because they had all of these backwoods trails, to communications routes. They found out really fast that there was a raid, but who would ever guess it's a white guy? That makes a lot of sense, but it took years for him to share that. What's also bad is we're finding out that people who have families, this county has many families going back to before the Civil War, the Ropers, the Johnsons, the Washingtons and the Bransons and Shepherds, and they had go with that. The point is, they never told their kids about John Brown for fear of what would happen if they said something in public. So generation after generation it was a sealed box. And they've been deprived of education too, because they've never been given. We all have to work on developing and understanding the African American perspective, local or nationally, whatever, instead of just white historians picking and choosing little pieces of African American history for their needs. So that's pretty much all I have to say for now. Thank you.
I think it's really important to understand that Harpers Ferry is unlike so many other places in the Upper South or the Deep South, in that it's a place of transition. There's movement, lots of free movement in and out of Harpers Ferry. It's not stagnant. And of course, the principal reason for this movement, these transitory aspects of Harpers Ferry is the railroad, both the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, of course, connecting the Chesapeake Bay with the Ohio River Valley, the Winchester Potomac Railroad, connecting the Shenandoah Valley with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. There is a tremendous amount of people who are total strangers coming through Harpers Ferry every day. If you will, think of it as the airport of its day. Harpers Ferry is like an airport terminal. It just, so many people. This was not classic Southern society. Harpers Ferry didn't represent that. The other thing we need to understand about Harpers Ferry is that it is industrial. Now, we usually don't think of antebellum South as industrial. Harpers Ferry is, and it has been. It was created as an industrial center dating back to the time of Washington as president. And so not only do we have this huge transition, this influx and outflux of total strangers coming in and out of Harpers Ferry every day of the year, but we also have people moving in and out of Harpers Ferry who work there for a short period of time and move somewhere else. And so, it's not even stationary with respect to jobs. Now, I mention this because Harpers Ferry, you would think there'd be a lot of suspicion. We think of the South in the antebellum period as the greatest terror, the greatest fear of a Southerner. And of course, they didn't talk about this, but every Southerner knew their greatest fear was insurrection, slave insurrection. They all knew that to hold a human being in bondage was inhuman. It's unnatural. Human beings aren't meant to exist in bondage. And of course, we have all the biblical references that the Southerners use to justify the existence of slavery and say that this is right, this is proper, and this is granted to us by God. But always deep inside, they were terrified They were absolutely terrified, knowing that freedom is a universal desire of all humanity. And so slavery is an extremely unnatural state. It's just not natural. And so a place like Harpers Ferry, there's also suspicion. There's always suspicion with this underlying fear, this underlying potential for terror. And just to give you an example, Jim was kind enough to mention the book Confluence that I had the privilege to write as soon as I retired from Harpers Ferry, along with co-author Catherine Magee. And we spent quite some time researching Harpers Ferry and its environs in terms of the overall situation of trying to investigate this not so hidden terror. And one of our greatest sources was the Hagerstown newspapers. And as an example, the Hagerstown Herald of Freedom will write in 1846, this is of course 13 years prior to Brown, but this was a prevalent feeling in the area almost a decade and a half before Brown comes to Harpers Ferry and inflames this hidden terror. But they were already pretty terrified, even in 1846. This is from the editorial page in the Herald of Freedom from Hagerstown. We believe that these influences, and the influences they're talking about, influences, another word for abolitionist. We believe that these influences consist of a set of prowling missionaries of both races who, under the cloak of religion, contrive to avoid suspicion and thus reach and poison the mind of the slave with their worse than foolish doctrines of liberty and freedom. Worse than foolish doctrines of liberty and freedom. Inducements and promises such as never can be realized or held out to them about the comfortable home of the owner, to desert the comfortable home of the owner and to make his way into the north. There where he will be guaranteed free and uninterrupted enjoyment of the blessings of liberty and equal rights. Blessings by and by which both nature and education render the Negro incapable of appreciating. So not only do we, of course, have this strong sense of racism, but you can see they're already concerned in 1846 in the area around Harpers Ferry about the influence of the abolitionists. It's penetrated that much. And so these people are preaching doctrine that's already, to use a word they used, invading Southern culture and invading the Southern life, trying to persuade and encourage the slave to freedom and liberty. And so there's all this suspicion in a place like Harpers Ferry long before John Brown arrives, even though Harpers Ferry is daily a place of strangers.
I think that's well said. And, I think it would be useful to step back for a minute and say, and I'm going to move the discussion to the actions of the enslaved in a minute. But it's significant to note that while Virginia had debated a plan of gradual emancipation, and there were significant numbers of freed Blacks in the state up through really the antebellum era, as of the early 1830s, all discussion stops in the wake of Nat Turner. And that's the final sort of moment where if something were to happen through legislative channels, it was possible, but thereafter it became an impossibility. And I think what starts to change the discussion are the activities of the enslaved themselves. And although we have instances of slave flight as far south as Florida, as far southwest as Texas, sometimes in significant numbers, the Upper South affords in some instances more opportunities just because of geographical proximity. And both Gene and Jim and Dennis, I think too, are aware of some interesting, I don't want to say anomalies, but some interesting source materials that are connected to our slice of the world that are revealed in the 1860 slave schedules. And for those that are our audience members who may not be fully aware, census data is one of the many tools that historians use to get at the experiences of African Americans. And I think why I titled this program Searching for Hayward Shepherd is because he is at once a very elusive figure, yet also incredibly well documented. And given the laws of the time, African Americans were legally excluded from the rights or the abilities to read and write. But we know, of course, there was at least 5 to 10% of the population that could read and write. But nonetheless, source materials are elusive. This brings us to some white sources that can sometimes inform us about the experiences of African Americans. And Jim has created some pretty interesting maps for us that I'm going to queue up here. And it's going to be incredibly revealing as to how the forces that Dennis just talked about are compelling African Americans, and African Americans themselves are going to be compelled by their own wants and desires. And it makes a period of intense agitation right on the eve of the Civil War era in the wake of John Brown, but before Union troops ever set foot on Virginia soil, which in turn initiates one of the largest exoduses of enslaved peoples in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And so with that, I'm going to bring up some of your maps, Jim, if it's okay.
Mhm.
And we'll turn the discussion in that direction. And both
Yep.
Gene and Dennis, feel free to add.
Okay, great. I'm ready. Can I go?
Yeah, let me just get us up to the right.
Now, by the way, don't move that. Go
Nope.
back quickly. That's a very interesting painting by Horace Pippen.
Oh, okay.
He's one of the most important primitive artists right here. That, he said later, is his Harriet Pippen. He painted her into the picture of John Brown's hanging because she saw it. And he painted this in the 40s. But he's a very, very important primitive type painting, painted with one hand. One little tiny tidbit is this. He's got John Brown with a hat on. I found David Hunter Strother's drawing of John Brown in the wagon, also with a hat on, which I found interesting. So anyway, little footnote, but we can go forward now.
Okay.
Now, I want to say one thing. Dennis was talking about the anomaly, how the county's got 3 worlds. Harpers Ferry, industrial, kind of railroad oriented. Shepherdstown was sort of, or the northern part, sort of almost north. They had 64 households during the war, by their voting, that were northern in their sympathies. The center of the county was about as southern as Richmond. The big, by their votes when they were deciding whether to go to the secession convention, to go or stay, all the people who wanted to secede were the center of the county. So just know they completely different worlds. Doug Taylor, born in 1912, taught me so many things. He worked all over the county. He said, if you were working in Halltown and towards Harpers Ferry, it was fine. You'd play ball together, you'd eat each other's sandwiches. There wasn't the prejudice. You go, Bumgarner's farm is where Sheets is. You go towards Charlestown, he said it was bad. So these things never seem to fade. Harpers Ferry, okay, what we're talking about now is, even when the war began, the county had these oddly, incredibly different cultures. The exterior was very different than the center, Harpers Ferry and Shepherdstown. When John Brown's raid occurred, it created such incredible paranoia in the county, as has been said. If you were a slave owner, you were frantic on whether you should sell everybody south as soon as possible. And of course, the hostilities and the oppression probably went up tenfold during that time. And what happens? Clark County had about 80 as recorded escaped enslaved persons in the summer of 1860 in the US Census slave schedule. By the way, if you're trying to find the original pages, find that real number. You need that real number. And so the tension was extraordinary. And what you're seeing here is just a handful of families that took off. They had a special, Clark County, 80 some odd, smaller county than ours. Berkeley, with about 50% more population, had about half as many as those who were recorded as escaping from Jefferson County. Again, about 10 months later, 602 enslaved persons are listed with a big E in column 6. They took off. If you were to look down along the Shenandoah River, I don't know where it's kind of like anyway, fix that. These are all the E's. One reason it happened a lot here is there was on the Shenandoah River, there was the Shannondale Springs Resort that had a reputation for being connected to the down in the lower part of the county. You sort of see, you got the idea. But there was a resort on the Virginia side of that that you had to cross. A freed African-American boatman named Lawson Goins controlled the ferry boat, where all these escaping families meet, that took anyone to the famous Shannondale Resort that several presidents visited. But just a short distance from it, about was a 30-acre farm of freed African-Americans called Bushy Ridge. That I strongly believe was the beginning of the Underground Railroad North. So that was a big aid for us. Not only that, this is like it demolishes the notion of happily enslaved. Even more so, what was their response? They didn't come to John Brown's aid, exactly, really. But I went through the newspapers. And from the date of the raid, October 16, 17, to the hanging of John Brown, December 2nd, there's I have them listed here. You could show them if you wanted to, Jim. One suspicious fire after another. Now, these are more escapes. There's the jurors. There's that. Okay, see? What I'm saying here is the court proceedings began October 25th. First fire, George Folk. This is what the newspaper said. It's not me putting stuff on. He was up around Swan Pond. Let's keep going. That's the first one. Fire number 3. Okay, that's down just over the border. That's the McCormicks of the Grim of the other Reaper. Then Tate's. That's Belvedere on outside Charlestown. See, fire, one after another. Let's keep going. Fire Ruffin. This is a little ironic. Edwin Ruffin was one of the most biggest troublemakers history has ever known. He's reporting way too many suspicious fires. So let's keep going. Now that's not here, but it's indicative. Burns, November 1859. We're still close to the original raid. His farm today is right down 340, just south of the light for the high school. It's called Beverly. Fire. He was a jeweler. Let's keep going. That's the 7th one. Now, without elaborating, this Sarah Briscoe letter is extraordinarily important. It is only in the archives of the Berkeley County Historical Society. This is the kind of thing that most historians miss. She refers to Mr. W. Lucas. He was he lived where the Waffle House is, a little further down. But you see, she's saying that these all are being set. She doesn't think they're accidents. Let's keep going to the next one. Sabotage at Castleman's Ferry. Fire at Willis. Okay, Castleman's Ferry, way down in the kind of cable town, almost near Clark County. Keep going. And Mr. Myers had a fire. Willis, this is one of the most biggest slaveholders in the county, one of the top 3. That's kind of about where Bardane is. Again, 9, and it's only a little more than a month after. Now, someone could say, well, I doubt this is really all sabotage, but if you understand how tight the security was in the county, Governor Wise was stopped and detained, There wasn't any outsider coming in doing this. Let's just flip a little quickly. We won't go all through it. But there's LaRue's, that's down near Ripon. Let's keep going, another fire. Okay, that's good enough. There's more.
Yeah,
the
Jim,
very last.
I might mention that you can't blame these on natural lightning storms. That's not the time of the year that we have thunderstorms.
That's what Ruffin said.
Yeah, I mean, it's just we're not having. Well, let's put it this way: these aren't lightning strikes coming from heaven. These are lightning strikes that are being generated from the earth, but intentionally by people to make it known that John Brown has a lot more support through other means, through terror or through just basically a form of self-defense. These fires represent in many ways. And so I think, that's a real great story. You've done tremendous research here. Jean alludes to this in the work that she's done. I've talked about it, but I've never done the great research you have. Have been so pinpoint and specific with all these fires that are occurring in Jefferson County, Clark County, Berkeley County, right here on the border. I mean, these people or enslaved people, we're going to let it be known that, okay, that may not have worked, but we're not finished yet.
Yeah, and what's so proper about this is it's a wonderful juxtaposition to the memorial, what the attitudes were. To tie it all together, right after John Brown's hanging, Dennis and everybody, there's one more incendiary event, and it is at George W. Turner's farm, the man who was killed by the raiders at the raid. So it kind of brings it all together.
Jean, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I found, incidentally, when I researched these and read the local newspapers, it was on microfilm, and it was right at Shepherd College that I was able to do this reading in the late 1970s. And at the same time, I met local African Americans, a minister, Reverend Albert Moser, who is here this evening, offered me a place to stay if I could continue to do the research. So I stayed with Mrs. Dora Washington right on German Street up the hill and was able to do more research. I think the fires were signals. And I talked with Professor Benjamin Quarles about this, the people could not believe that the white support was so small, that John Brown's army was so small. There must be more waiting just to come over and help them. And so these fires could have been signals saying, hey, come on, we're here. And of course, there wasn't anybody waiting.
I'm going to bring into a question that we have from the audience in a second. But first, let me thank everyone for the input. And I just want to put this in a bit of a broader context. This is a phenomenon that's seen throughout the American South in the last years of the antebellum era. I have a colleague who's now a professor at Utah State who's working on this. She's found this occurring throughout Texas in 1859 and 1860. She's actually interested in some of the stuff that's happening in Virginia around Brown that Jim and Jean and Dennis have just referenced. And so it demonstrates a level of upheaval and unrest that I think white audiences were entirely unprepared for, yet it's very much a harbinger. By the close of the American Civil War era, the estimates vary, but professors Steve Hahn and Stephanie McCurry put the number at maybe 800,000. 800,000 enslaved peoples may have fled the plantation complex out of an enslaved population of 4 million. It's a pretty significant number. And so the type of unrest that we're witnessing right at the eve of the Civil War era is a bit of a microcosm, but it'll become a macrocosm soon as the South is fundamentally transformed. Now, I do want to go to one of the questions that we have, and I hope I get this right. Jim Cummings notes, and Cummins, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, I apologize. He notes that there's a certain fluidity of movement in this area, and that's exactly right. Some colleagues and I are working on a historic resource study of Ferry Hill right across the river from Shepherdstown, and we know that the enslaved population there came into the community of Shepherdstown, in some instances consumed too much alcohol, and then there was repercussions that followed at the plantation. We know that they were engaged in an underground economy. There's the movement of goods in this region. There's a type of fluidity that Dennis really talked about and highlighted. And so I think what the question is basically, and any of you can comment on this, what are the repercussions in 1859, 1860 for Black populations. What happens in the wake of all of this, if you can comment on it, and how is the atmosphere now starting to shift as tensions are starting to ratchet up?
I'll just give one example. I've done a lot about John Fox, who was a young man working for the Dandridge family, and he was at a farm in Carneysville. His descendant, Bertha Fox Jones, told me that he had access. This is his response. He was near the trains that came through Carneysville and stopped to get water. And I asked her, did he do anything with Underground Railroad? And she said, yes, he smuggled guys in on the cars and covered them with hay when they stopped at Carneysville to get water. But that's one response. Maybe it's sort of an answer of an example. I mean, look, the train is a huge fluidity, okay? The railroad is fluidity itself.
And I'll add, I think Dennis might be searching for a quote, but before our presentation, we were sort of just talking about this and that, and the name Ed Bars came up. And one of the points that Ed Bars raises in Ken Burns's famed Civil War documentary is that before John Brown's raid, the militia system in the American South, I think he calls it a joke. That might be a bit of an overstatement. The militia state system had always been in place. Slave patrols were always a very vexing reality for enslaved peoples. But 1859, 1860 sees a militarization of the Southern landscape. White Southern men start escalating the numbers of slave patrols.
Right.
Numbers
Okay.
of militias begin to solidify our region, witnesses an uptick in those areas. And so there is a much more, I guess, militaristic environment that is occurring throughout the South, but we also see in the microcosm of Jefferson County. And so by default, I think what fluidities and, I hate to use the word liberties, but liberties were allowed. I think that we're going to see that kind of clamped down in this narrow window right before the Civil War years. But Dennis, did you find?
Yeah, again, Catherine and I added in confluence. We were very interested in the very question you're asking, Jim, is how did the local population deal with offenders in Harpers Ferry? And in fact, the town of Harpers Ferry was not chartered as a town until the early 1850s. The federal government owned virtually all the land there. And so finally, the Federal Armory began selling off many of its lots. And at that point, Harpers Ferry was able to become incorporated in 1851. So the town finally has its own ordinances. The town finally has its own mayor, its own council. Well, here's an example. I mean, this is a legal ordinance adopted by Harpers Ferry. Now we think of Harpers Ferry as being, as Jim said, progressive, the progressive part of Jefferson County. Well, let's see how progressive they are. Here's the actual ordinance. It shall be the duty of the town sergeant to lodge in jail each and every colored person. Notice it didn't say slave or free. Each and every colored person whom he may find upon the streets, lanes, or alleys after 10 o'clock at night. Unless such colored person is on urgent business, and if a slave must have a written order from master or mistress. And then they go on to talk about the punishment, and the punishment was lashing. You would be lashed, you'd be put in jail, you'd be lashed, and you could be lashed up to a maximum of 39 times with a whip. So this is official legal language in the Harpers Ferry town ordinances.
When Dennis?
Deal with African Americans that just happen to be roaming or on the streets, regardless of reason, after 10 o'clock in the evening.
What time period is that?
That was 1852.
Okay, let me just add this. When Martin Delaney wrote his book, Blake, The Huts of America, which was remarkable because it was about a traveling insurrectionist, he takes, at one section, he comes into definitely Jefferson County. You know, anybody mentions Bolivar, but there's a moment, and it's sort of it's only semi-fictional, but he does describe being accosted by one of the patrols, and barely getting away. So I'm just throwing that in. That's a bit earlier.
I opened by talking about how transient Harpers Ferry is, how many people pass through on the railroads. So isn't it interesting? Hayward Shepherd, an African-American working for the Winchester Potomac Railroad, he's working at night. I mean, he works after 10 o'clock. His shift is after 10 o'clock. So he is technically not in violation of the ordinance because he has purpose. He has business that he's conducting, and people in Harpers Ferry know that. But what about someone who's coming through on a train? A free African-American that's traveling into Harpers Ferry and happens to stop there and decide, well, I think I may stay here, and is roaming the streets trying to find a place to stay for the night. Well, according to this ordinance, you're going to jail. We don't care if you're free African-American or not, and we don't care whether you're traveling or not. If the town sergeant decides that you're a potential threat, our ordinance says we can jail you just because you happen to be traveling into Harpers Ferry.
Wow.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that hopefully addresses the question, and also I think just further illuminates conditions here on the ground. And I guess it is notable, and Dennis, you probably know the percentages, but there is a significant free Black population in Harpers Ferry and in Jefferson County. I want to say it's split between enslaved and free. Is that right or no?
Well, in Harpers Ferry, we have 300 people that are African-American. Our overall population of Harpers Ferry, Bolivar, Virginia Island combined is about 3,000. So 10% of the local population is African-American. Of that 10%, 300 people, 150 are free Blacks.
Yeah. Okay.
In Harpers Ferry.
Okay.
And let me add this. I mentioned earlier from Jim Taylor how every type of situation exists in this county with Blacks, African-Americans. If you look at the 1850 census, for some reason, Dennis, I can't remember Mr. Roper's first name, the farmer, but you had a mixed race man who in 1850 in the census had the largest dollar value real estate in all of the county of any race. Now, isn't it just, we have one anomaly on top of another, and he got through the Civil War and got out the other end, still owning the land. What a place.
So we had a lot to cover, and I think I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up maybe as getting us a little bit more towards a point of finality here, the monument that is eventually erected. And again, with this concept of searching for Hayward Shepherd, he's invoked in many ways, memorialized in different ways, and maintains this kind of profound relevancy into the modern era. But that story, and it's a hard transition, but nonetheless, I'm gonna make it. That story gets us into the 20th century. And so at this point, I want to turn over to Dennis. And as I said at the beginning, Dennis spent 30 plus years at Harpers Ferry, a career that culminated as chief historian of the park. And he, as we said earlier, has lived history. I hate dating people. But I want to first bring up the monument itself and then allow Dennis to talk a little bit about its changing roles and place in Harpers Ferry, if that's fair. So let me first get us to the image. And for those of you tuning in online, obviously computer sizes are going to vary, but I'm hoping that the resolution is high enough. If you want me to read it, maybe just drop a comment in the chat, but otherwise, maybe we could just take a moment to read the text of the monument. Let me see. Yeah, okay. So I think the resolution is high enough on my laptop. So just a couple seconds here. Okay. So Dennis, can you give us some history behind the monument and it's again, it's sort of changing place in Harpers Ferry?
Well, the monument is constructed by, paid for by, written by, and placed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy and Sons of Confederate Veterans. I recall in Jefferson County, even in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, both the UDC and the SCV, very strong chapters in Jefferson County. We need to understand that Jefferson County, 9 out of every 10 soldiers who served in the Civil War coming from Jefferson County, 90% of those soldiers served in the Confederate Army. There were a total of 10 different organizations, entities from Jefferson County that served under Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson or J.E.B. Stuart. And so the county had before the war was not pro-secession, voted against secession initially, but that changed as a result of the firing on Sumter. And of course, we then, Charlestown, Harpers Ferry, Shepherdstown, we had different allegiances throughout the war, some remaining very pro-Union, much of it becoming, though, very pro-Confederate once Virginia decided to secede. So this monument was built, placed there in Harpers Ferry in 1931. There was a large dedication ceremony, and it was part of what was known as the Faithful Slave Memorials. Let me put that in plural. Harpers Ferry is not the only place this thing exists. There are places throughout the South where we have these faithful slave memorials. And as you read it, you could see that its principal statement is that the Civil War gave the African American population an opportunity to be Nat Turners, and they weren't. And so the monument's trying to say that thank you for not rising up in rebellion against us in the same way that Nat Turner did. And thank you for being loyal to a system of enslavement. That's in essence what the monument says. Of course, this was placed there in Harpers Ferry in the context of the Jim Crow South at the height of segregation. The 19-teens, 1920s, we saw a renewal of the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan membership was at its height in the 1920s. Jefferson County had a very active Ku Klux Klan membership in the 1920s. If you don't believe me, read the local newspapers. They'll tell you quite a bit about Klan activity in Jefferson County in the 1920s. And so, it's the lost cause. This is also represents the period, the epitome of lost cause. So there's a lot of influences and factors here, which in context generate this monument. In 1975, it suddenly disappeared. I remember that. I was working at Harpers Ferry in 1975. And this gets back to my point of I actually have lived this history. It disappeared because where it was on Potomac Street, the National Park Service began a multi-million-dollar restoration effort on that group of buildings. And the Park Service, who had obtained ownership of the monument simply through transfer of land in 1953, the Park Service took the monument and removed it so that it would not be damaged during this construction period. Well, it was taken to the park maintenance yard, and there it was placed on the ground. And I remember this very distinctly. I could take you today to the maintenance yard and tell you the spot where the monument was. And just through sheer neglect, nobody paid any attention to this massive piece of stone. And it, over time, completely disappeared. It was hidden. It just completely disappeared under sand and dirt and other types of things that you would find in a maintenance facility. It wasn't intentional. It just was buried. And there it was buried. And Miss Lucille Bush, who I'll never forget, was a very active member of the local United Daughters of the Confederacy. And Miss Lucille, that's how I referred to her, Miss Lucille would come into Harpers Ferry in her Buick every other morning when I would be out opening up the town, and she would say, "Hello, Ranger Dennis, where's my monument?" Well, now, of course, I'm, 20 some years old. I don't have anything to do with where this monument is, but I know where it is. And I know where it's buried. It's literally buried. And so she became quite active in, as a proponent to bring the monument back, And we had a new superintendent at the park at the time. Don Campbell had just commenced his career there. He was not only a new superintendent, this was his first superintendency. And Mr. Campbell was approached by Miss Bush numerous times about her monument. Mr. Campbell discovered the monument up at the maintenance yard, and sure enough, there it was, buried. And so now Mr. Campbell had a problem because this monument can be deemed offensive by many who read it, and others were trying to bring it back as a memorial. And so what does the superintendent do? What should he do? Well, the superintendent actually did as a superintendent should do. He thought, okay, we've got various factions here. Let's talk to them and see if we can figure out some compromise. And so the superintendent talked with our local NAACP, who was very familiar with the monument, of course, and the UDC and the SCV. He spoke with all these people, and eventually a compromise was reached. And the compromise was, we will return, meaning we, the Park Service, we will return the monument to its original location. However, we will cover it up. We literally had a plywood box fashioned to place over top the monument to cover it up. And the compromise was that anytime anyone wanted to see the monument, we would move the box. Otherwise, it would be behind the box. So nobody would see anything but a plywood box. And we had it nicely painted so it would fit in nicely with the brick building in the background to try to make it invisible. Now, I remember saying to Mr. Campbell, I was a young historian, upstart to say the least. I probably shouldn't have said such things to him. I said, Mr. Campbell, we shouldn't cover up history. Yes, it is offensive. In my mind, it's offensive. As a historian, I can't just use my judgment, my opinion. We need to tell this story. We should not run away from this story. We should tell this story. We should use this as part of our interpretation and let our visitors make their own decisions, their own judgments about where this stands in history. Eventually, as chief historian, I was able to be the principal investigator on a major research project that Mary Johnson did for us. She was a historian working for me at the time, now works in West Virginia for the State Archives. And Mary did a lot of research on the history of this monument. We discovered it actually commenced as early in the 19-teens, but it didn't actually get built and put in place until 1931. It was controversial even within the UDC. And there was all this different language that kept going back and forth as to what it should say. But eventually it was placed. Even the placement was controversial. The commemoration was controversial. The Storer College choir was there. The Storer College president was there. The president is white. The choir was black. W.B. Du Bois learned about this, absolutely went to the moon in objection to having this monument placed in Harpers Ferry and demanded that the Storer College president allow him to have a refutation to refute this monument with another monument of his own of the NAACP to be placed on the John Brown Fort itself, which at that time was at Storer College campus. Dr. McDonald, the president of Storer College, said, no, not doing that. We're not going to put a monument on the John Brown Fort. And so Du Bois' words were written, but never placed in Harpers Ferry. And we discovered these words as a result of the research we were doing in the 1990s on this monument and its story. And so I came up with the idea of let's uncover the monument, let the monument speak for itself, and let's bring Dr. Du Bois' words in beside the monument so that those words can be seen as well, his original refutation of this monument. And so we did that. We created an exhibit beside the monument where Du Bois' words are the prominent part of that exhibit. And when visitors go there today, they get two different stories. They get two different perspectives. They get two different angles of history. And it's good. It's good because it forces people to stop and consider and think and to discover that history is never a single frame. that it is a very diverse perspective on what people think. And so these two things side by side, the monument and the exhibit, one the words of the UDC SCV and the other the words of Dr. W.B. Du Bois, tell an incredible and powerful story that surprises visitors at Harpers Ferry.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dennis. I think it's a nice bookend. Jean started us off with this silent testimony, a lost grave that's eventually found, and Dennis will bring us back to a very different type of testimony, a very different sort of manipulation of memory. And so with that, as we approach our hour mark, which is hard to believe, these things always go so quickly. I want to give everyone one last opportunity to speak. And so just briefly, if you will, maybe just give us some insight as to how you came to either Shepherd or John Brown as a historical figure early on in your career, or if you're sort of reflective at this phase of your career and thinking back, what have they meant to you? Just maybe a brief summation about how you have personally interfaced with these two really significant local figures who have this long deep national story. And I'll start with Jean if it's okay.
Yes, I'd like to put this picture here that maybe Hayward Shepherd.
Yes.
This is how I got into this and got you into it.
Yes.
So let me back up so you can see it. I
love it.
Yeah, I think that the person in the right, the left foreground here may be possibly Hayward Shepherd. This was taken in June 1858. And this is Martinsburg, West Virginia, or it was Virginia then. And what made me come look at this was his hat. And if you compare it with a hat on the Henderson drawing, it's the same hat. And it's the same, but what's more is there's this presence here that we know about him. This presence of being a strong individual, someone who is good at his job, and who is, frankly, he runs the railroad. That's what's going on. And so I'm hoping to research this farther. And so this is what brought me into this program, and to propose to you, let's talk about this. Let's see if this might be a photographic image of Hayward Shepherd.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
Jim?
Well, I don't have a great photograph like that, but I simply can only say that Dennis and Jean were some of the first people I met when I came around here around 82, around there. And I went to Colgate, majored in history, worked for American Heritage, fact checking when Jeff Ward was still editor, and always history there. But I came here, and what strikes you is history is alive here. It's not, it's not past. And so Jean and Dennis were the first, and a lot of people liked the same thing. They loved history here. So that was my first awakening. And a guy named, Jean knows this, Jim Fisher, who was my griot. And of course, supreme irony, I was asked to house sit at Leland for 4 years. That was owned by the cousin of Robert E. Lee with all the original furniture. So of course you're going to fall all the way in.
That's fair. It's a seductive region. We've certainly enjoyed our time here immensely. And I'll allow Dennis on, again, Shepherd's Day of Giving, because Dennis has given us a tremendous amount at the George Southern Moore Center. So I'm going to allow Dennis to have our last words and close us out. So Dennis.
Well, first of all, I think Jean Libby represents the national and international attraction of Harpers Ferry. And in this case, John Brown. I mean, Gene's California. And I remember first meeting Gene way back in 1979, I think, 40 plus years ago now.
Yeah.
And I was just a kid then, but Gene, I was so impressed that Gene had come all the way from California to my home. I grew up here. This is home for me. I've lived here all my life. I've grown up with John Brown, literally, as an image that just doesn't fade. He doesn't go away. His spirit, his soul truly does go marching on. That's just been part of my daily existence here, growing up in Washington County, Maryland, where John Brown's headquarters was located. So when Jean came in from California, she left such a great impression on me. I'm thinking, you know, there really is something to this Harpers Ferry and John Brown fella, that she would be so impressed to come here, research here, and spend so much time and dedicate so much of herself to trying to understand my own backyard. So I want to thank you, Jean, for all that you've done over the years to try to help us locally understand better our local history. You've really been tremendous. And I can't say enough about Jim Surkamp and all the great work he's done, especially through American Public University and the research. Just tremendous. I mean, go to the webpage, check out what Jim's done in terms, it's groundbreaking. And again, diving into history, local history that we never knew locally. So thank you, Jim, for all that great effort. And Dr. Broomall, I'm a great admirer of yours, Jim. I'm so thankful that you are the leader of the center. And I'm happy to give as much as I can give to you in the center, because you're producing great students who are going to be great historians as we go forward. So I appreciate your continued mentorship of all those young people. That's what helped me as a young Shepherd student, and you're continuing that Shepherd tradition. And I also want to thank my father, John Frye. Dad actually was a local historian here in Washington County, Maryland. For now almost 70 years, people have gone to John Frye to answer questions about Washington County history. And my dad actually can take, he won't do it, but I'll give him credit for it. He can take a lot of credit for the preservation of John Brown's headquarters, the Kennedy Farm. Dad actually suggested to Captain Southland, when he came into Washington County looking for a historic property to buy, Dad said, "This is for you. This place is for you." And it was the Kennedy Farm, which was a decrepit wreck in 1973 when Captain Lynn purchased it. It is not anymore. It's been beautifully restored. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of Lynn family money have gone into that property to protect it. It's now a National Historic Landmark. I commend the Lynn family, but even more, my dad had the foresight, the vision to say, this one's for you. And basically that saved that property. So, you know, John Brown, for me, has never been a foreigner, never been a stranger. John Brown's always been a neighbor.
Well,
May I add a word to that?
yeah, of course.
I'd like to also thank John Frye very much. I came in from California and met him, and he looked at the primary sources, particularly Osbert Anderson's escape, and he said, "I know where that is. I can take you there." No one had ever done this. All the historians come around and they sit in their armchairs and they write about the John Brown raid. It happened here. And he knew it. He could just look at it. And so he took me all around and we explored, and any questions that I had, and he gave me such an appreciation for the terrain as an important part of history. It is the history. The terrain has to be in it. And so I thank you very much too, John.
I think that's a good note to conclude on. And so to our audience, thank you very much. If we didn't get anything to your questions, I think I tried to address most of them, but Tim and I, the administrative assistant at the center, will go back, and I do owe Tim Ware a thanks. Tim put together the PowerPoints and has been the communicator for all of this. I get a little overwhelmed during the semester, and so Tim's been absolutely integral in helping realize this program. And to my my participants, thank you so much. This was a wonderful evening. To my audience, again, thank you. And until next time, I'll wish everyone good health, happiness, and stay well. and I'll look forward to seeing you virtually and at some point, perhaps even in person. So with that, we'll go ahead and close out the evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody, bye.